I so don't feel like a rock star. I can't tell you how less I feel like a rock star. And I don't really know why I'm speaking last on this panel, because I have to speak from a different space. And I've spent time thinking about that space. So part of what I'm going to share with you today is thinking about these issues of not just who gets to speak, but more particularly who is heard and by whom. So I'm reflecting from my position, definitely now in my life, as a privileged white woman. And this thinking took me to a place that I didn't think I was going to get to, but I'm going to share that with you as we go along. Thank you for the invitation to come back to Iceland. Those of you who know me know that I love Iceland. One of the reasons I love it is the wildness of this country. It is a country that will not be tamed by humanity. It is of itself. And I love places like that because I think we all get tamed by having to live in this world. And so wild places give food to that wild part in me. And I need to keep her fed because I get tempted by some of the privileges that are on offer. So I want to begin by absolutely recognizing that there are much greater considerations for many women in speaking about violence and abuse. And those are about being located in the intersections of inequalities. And it's harder for those women also to be recognized as survivors. They speak and they are not heard. And if there isn't a climate of belief, it's harder to speak. If you're already marginalized, it's harder to speak. And as we've already heard, if you're in situations of precariousness in your life and your livelihood, it's harder to speak. But then I found myself asking, are there dangers if we tell just that story? Can it become a form of othering? That there are groups of women who are not expected to speak, and therefore when they do speak, the we of white women don't hear them. We don't pay attention when they do speak. We don't recognize the ways that things are said differently. Angela Davis talked yesterday about blues. Two of my PhD students have written about how Black Caribbean heritage women have talked about sexual violence in their novels and their poetry. So we need to ask who we're attending to. Who's the me in MeToo? And what's the we when we say women? And I attended a talk earlier this year by a woman called RIKK, where she talked about the habits of whiteness. And this has stayed with me ever since, that we have ways as white women of nodding to intersectionality, but actually we're not decentering our whiteness. And so some of what I want to say speaks to that. There have been women's movements over time in many, many spaces and places. And marginalised women have been part of those movements, and quite often they've been leaders in those movements. But those aren't the histories of feminism that are the ones that are presented generally. And women in many countries took up MeToo, but not always in the same way. And I just want to add some examples into this conversation. I'm sure there are many, many more. And part of my message is we need to be interested in what women everywhere are doing, and we need to pay attention to what those women are doing and why they're doing it the way they are. This is just a few of the many, many versions of MeToo there have been. Just as a matter of record. And the Chinese one I find particularly interesting. They were, their original tweets were censored, and so they used the word, the sound mi in Chinese is rice, and the word tu is rabbit. So they created these emojis that they used in their tweets and in their speaking to be able to speak to each other in their own language. And there was a particular exposure there of university professors. Male university professors seem to feature rather a lot in MeToo. We've yet to have too many of that yet in the UK, but I'm sure it will come. And it's often PhD students, the students who are most dependent upon their supervisors, who invest 3, 4, 5 years of their life in something, and those supervisors have huge power over PhD students. And she spoke out about her professor, and he actually lost his teaching profession as a result. And women in China have also spoken out about sports coaches, about leaders of NGOs, and also a temple abbot in one place. And actually, in this year or maybe early next year, there will be a law in China that will use the words sexual harassment for the very first time. And that's the work of those women. This is a story from India. Some of you may know this. The very first response to MeToo in India was a Dalit PhD student called RIKK, and she compiled a list of abusive male academics that was published in 2017, and it caused a huge fury and debate within Indian feminism. There were a number of women who thought that this was outrageous, that it was taking the law into our own hands, and there were those activists who argued, as I would, that actually patriarchal law has never protected women, and actually sometimes we need to do things our way, a different way. But the most important thing about this is that her action had very limited purchase. And what most of us know about when MeToo took off in India is that it was about Bollywood. It was about actors and actresses. And there's a really interesting piece by someone whose first name I can't remember, about how easily RIKK's name has been forgotten and how it parallels what happened to Tamara Burke. And Perna reminded me this morning that in the most recent publication, when we say that it's only certain women who speak, there's a picture of an entire group of Dalit women in India meeting together around MeToo. So part of what I think we need to be is a wonderful African-Caribbean poet called Grace Nichols, and one of her books was called I Am a Long-Memoried Woman. And I've held on to that idea. I think we need to be long-memoried women. We need to hold on to the names of our activists. We need to remember all the women who are part of speaking out, but particularly the ones who speak out earliest. This is what happened in Mexico. In Mexico, there was a very slow response to MeToo. And then activists there created particular hashtags about particular professions. And the first one was about writers. But they also did something, and I gather there was some discussion about this morning, about creating a space of anonymity, that actually they recognise that for some women, what they risk is too much. So there could be a space where they could write their experience, name their abuser, and someone else would post it without them having to be named themselves. So there are strategies that have been created to enable more women to speak. And that's International Women's Day this year in Mexico City. And many of those posters are linked to MeToo. So the last thing I want to say is it's a concept taken from one of those PhD students, one called Jo Wilson, and her PhD is based on the experiences of African Caribbean women and also black feminists in the UK. And she, at the centre of her PhD is this notion of a space to speak. And the women who she interviewed looked for spaces to speak. They found certain spaces. Sometimes those were more private spaces. But actually, they all wanted. It was something that they sought and wanted and needed. They needed to be able to speak about the violence that they had experienced. And like many of the women who are involved in the research that we do, sometimes being involved in research and being asked to share your story is one of those spaces to speak. So I think there are ways in which researchers can be part of this process too. So I think of MeToo as a global space to speak. And that some of it is the kitchen table talk that we do with each other. And some of it is more like standing on this platform. But those are all spaces to speak. And that we need to value and grow by and for spaces to speak, wherever they are created, whoever they are created for. But my big message, especially to the white women here, is we need to be, as Cynthia said this morning, more curious. We need to think and want to know about where and how women are speaking. Thank you.